welcome back from the lunch break. It's been a fantastic morning already with the talks that we've had, and we're ready now for a fantastic afternoon with more talks and more inspiration. And we're joined, first of all, we have the honor to invite Jojo Mehta to speak with us, who's a real leader in the fight for environmental justice. She's the co-founder and CEO of Stop Ecocide International, which is an organization that she established in 2017 with the late Polly Higgins. Jojo has played a central role in building and driving the global movement to recognize ecocide and the mass destruction of ecosystems as a crime under international law. And through Jojo's tireless efforts, she has overseen the remarkable growth in the movement, navigating all of the intersections of the legal development, diplomacy, and public narrative. And she's chair of the Stop Ecocide Foundation and convener of the independent expert panel for the legal definition of ecocide. And their definition, launched in 2021, has sparked legislative conversations and resolutions on national and international scales. And so today we're really glad to be joined by Jojo to give us a fuller insight and understanding of the ecocide law movement and the development of this legal tool that seeks to hold those who are most responsible for environmental destruction accountable and prevent the worst environmental harms, and encourage a massive shift in sustainability and respect for nature. So please do pop any and all questions in the chat and we'll pop them to Jojo afterwards. But please now join me in welcoming Jojo Mehta to speak to us today. Welcome, Jojo.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's great to see so many here online today and giving up their weekend and recognizing a few names as well in the list of participants. Lovely to see you. And it's an honor to be here. It's a bit of a different context to my usual engagements, and that allows me to sort of broaden the range of what I can bring, which is always enjoyable and welcome. And I'm also much looking forward to the interactive part, which is always exciting and often takes the conversation in new directions. So, if questions come up as I'm talking, please jot them down, keep them handy, pop them in the chat so that we can have a good discussion afterwards. And, remember, this is obviously in some ways a specialist topic. There are no stupid questions. If you want to get technical, you want to get spiritual, anything else, please feel free. So I'm going to start with what it says on the tin in terms of my talk and give a brief introduction to ecocide law, the progress of the initiative around the world, and how in particular it can set the framework for a responsible relationship with nature. Indeed, arguably, it is already beginning to do this. And then afterwards, I'd like to explore some of the cultural and mindset aspects a little bit more deeply before we get on to the discussion part. So as Jonathan said in the introduction, I co-founded what is now Stop Ecocide International with my dear departed friend and inspiring legal pioneer, the late and wonderful Polly Higgins. Polly dedicated the last decade of her life to the resurrection of this concept of ecocide, and also to a very concrete and singular mission. So to have ecocide established as an international crime, alongside war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. Now, if we stop for a moment and think about what world we might be living in now, if ecocide had been included in the list of international crimes back in 2002, which is when the International Criminal Court, or ICC for short, when it first opened its doors, we will pretty soon realize that our world might look very different indeed, and our planet and our children would be feeling a lot safer. Polly discovered that, in fact, this could actually have happened, but for the objections of certain states, certain countries, back in the 1990s, during negotiations within the International Law Commission, negotiations which preceded those that became the Rome Statute, the ICC's governing document, which was signed in 1998. Polly, therefore, thought of her life's work, she considered her life's work to be restoring what she saw as the missing crime. And tragically, as some of you may know, Polly died of a highly aggressive lung cancer in 2019. However, she lived just long enough to see the demand for ecocide law taken to the streets by Extinction Rebellion in April of that year. And this was hugely poignant. And she actually recognized it as the beginning of the public campaign really taking off, recognizing also in her incredibly inimitable, pragmatic way that her own departure would in itself prove to be a galvanizing factor. And she was right. I mean, an international campaign is quite a thing to literally inherit. But what happened next was pretty amazing. Some were afraid that the work would die with Polly, but far from that being the case. I mean, as her closest associate, I started to receive communications from all over the world, from campaigners, politicians, lawyers, and many more, asking what they could do to help. And word spreads in mysterious ways, it seems, because by the end of 2019, Pope Francis had endorsed ecocide law, and the small Pacific Ocean Republic of Vanuatu had already called for its consideration at the International Criminal Court. And 5 years later, it would again be Vanuatu, along with sister Pacific nations, Fiji and Samoa, that actually tabled a formal amendment proposal at the ICC to add an independent crime of ecocide to the Rome Statute. This literally just happened only a few months ago at the UN in New York. And shortly afterwards, at the UN Biodiversity Conference in Colombia, the Democratic Republic of Congo publicly announced support for this proposal as well. And that's highly significant from a leading African nation, which is also one of the 3 great rainforest nations of the world. And all 4 of those states announced their support by co-hosting a major event in The Hague just last month in December at the ICC's annual assembly. Last year also saw an EU Environmental Crime Directive adopted, a directive that addresses some conduct comparable to ecocide. That's what they're calling it, comparable to ecocide. And that's the first time that the term ecocide has actually been used in EU law. And proposals of ecocide law have also been submitted and are progressing and even being adopted in a number of national parliaments as well, from Belgium to Brazil and from Italy to Peru. So from zero government discussion to inclusion in an EU directive and a multi-state proposal at the International Criminal Court in just 5 years. For international law, that's, well, it's kind of rocket speed. And those 5 years have been extraordinary. We've worked with diplomatic, legal, NGO, business and academic colleagues and allies. We've worked with committed politicians in many individual countries and at the EU, with indigenous and faith leaders and groups who have championed ecocide law, with youth voices who have called for it in so many different contexts. Also, of course, with our own branches, associate teams and networks around the world, with all our supporters, donors, funders, Earth Protector members, and also with journalists, writers and filmmakers who have recognised the importance of ecocide law. So as you can hear, it has been and it will continue to be a mammoth collaborative endeavour. And the role of Stop Ecocide International has been at the leading edge, so to speak, but we've also been acting as a kind of a glue, connecting all those many actors and contributors in an organically distributed network or a web, if you like, a web of connection, of advocacy and truly diverse expertise. So it's been, and it still is, a remarkable journey where I and many others have learned on the job and evolved with the process. We started out very much in a kind of on-the-ground grassroots activist space, and I personally came from on-the-ground environmental activism. But over time, we've had to work with the development of the initiative, and we've ultimately had to become diplomats, as the recognition of ecocide has become a tangible legislative direction of travel, you might put it, in multiple governments and at global level. So let's just look at why it's so important to recognise ecocide as a serious crime. I mean, it's not like we're short of environmental laws and regulations around the world. However, as many in this audience will know, the existing rules are not working so well. Environmental harms continue at scale, and I'm sure I don't need to list the dangerous and depressing results of that here. But we understand this to be fundamentally a cultural issue. The global economic system is built on the Western canon of thought, which is firmly based in deep dualisms: spirit versus matter, reason versus emotion, heaven versus hell, masculine versus feminine. I mean, the list goes on. Until a very recent campaign extended it, the dictionary definition of nature even specifically excluded humans. And this mindset of separation has, well, it fueled the industrial age. And while undoubtedly improving global standards of living in unprecedented ways, it has also multiplied its disconnecting effects in sometimes terrifying ways. In a nutshell, while everyone on this call certainly benefits, all of us benefit from industrial progress every single day, our systems simply don't take seriously enough our effect on the deeply intertwined ecosystems that sustain life. In turn, this is preventing us from developing the truly balanced relationship with our planet that will enable humanity to thrive in harmony with the rest of the living world. In many communities, including, of course, this one, this disconnected mindset is being challenged, and it is slowly changing. However, it is understandably of primary interest to most people to ensure that they can put bread on the table for their children. And in this context, which is that of most people on the planet, worrying about climate or environment can be perceived as a luxury. And shifting mindsets in the absence of life-changing events can be a slow process. It can take generations. And it is by no means yet the norm in the boardrooms of those that dominate the global economic landscape. So we are obliged to look for systemic levers that can create rapid cultural change. And criminal law in particular is one of the most powerful of these. Why? Because it taps into our core sense of what is right and wrong, of what is acceptable and what is not. Criminal law and cultural change are connected, not exactly causally, but in terms of key nexi, or meeting points that create powerful shifts. The creation of the crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity arose in the 1940s in the context of the shocking events of the Holocaust. Not because horrific events, indeed genocides, hadn't happened previously. We know they had. They arose, these crimes arose, because the world was beginning to perceive this as unacceptable. The legal recognition of those concepts then ensured, in turn, that the cultural perception embedded itself. And the same could be said about the abolition of slavery, for example. An example closer to home, in the UK, for me anyway, is the Child Protection Act, which was passed in 1989. And I have to say, I still feel that is shockingly recent. I still have friends, I actually had, I still have friends whose parents actually campaigned against that law because they believed a parent had a pretty much God-given right to discipline their children however they saw fit. And yet now that it's a crime, if you were to stop someone in the street and ask them if they consider it okay to beat a child, everyone will tell you no, even those few who actually still do so. It's like the moral consciousness of a certain proportion of political actors has to shift to a point where the legislation can be passed. And then, because it has been passed and certain acts are now criminal, it has a rapid concrete effect that creates cultural change in the broader population. And we believe that we're reaching that point with environmental destruction at present. And this can work both ways, of course. And not long ago, I read a quote from the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, talking about why activist protest has been increasingly criminalized in many places, especially here in the UK. And the quote was very telling. And I quote, "Criminal law is cheap, it's quick, and it's a very effective deterrent." Not all governments use criminal law for the right reasons. However, what this quote says very clearly is why criminalizing truly harmful acts like ecocide will be a very economical and effective way to steer decision-making in a healthier direction. And this brings us to another important aspect of why criminal law is so important. It is fundamentally about deterrence. As someone observed to us recently, in the stick and carrot analogy, the beauty of a powerful stick is that it only needs using once or twice in order to be effective. We don't doubt for a second that ecocide prosecutions will be taken. And indeed, we know many lawyers are looking forward to using this law, and we even know the types of cases that are likely to be first in line. However, throwing lots of people in jail is not going to protect nature. Changes in decision-making behaviour will do that. Of course, the first couple of high-profile cases will absolutely underline the seriousness, but the real win starts to happen much further back in the story of causes and effects. Right now, we have a situation where corporations don't try terribly hard to tick the boxes when it comes to environmental obligations. And worse, they will pollute directly against these obligations. There's often nobody checking. It's cheaper not to tick the boxes or to carry out the impact assessments properly, and even a chunky fine can be worth it when balanced against enormous profits. And when a company's primary legal duty is to create shareholder return, this is actually perfectly logical behaviour, however reprehensible and however ultimately disastrous for people and planet. So one can imagine the difference in policy decisions, boardroom conversations, and operational sign-offs when the causing of severe and either widespread or long-term harm to the environment has become a criminal offence, for which the decision maker as an individual can be held responsible. That is going to create a serious pause for thought. In fact, it actually presents a whole new level of deterrence that potentially is kind of double. It bites fast, it bites twice. A top-level decision maker will not only be faced with potential loss of reputation and ultimately potential loss of personal freedom, they will also be faced with a crippling effect on the stock value of their company. When criminal activity is uncovered at high level, shares tend to tank. And Enron is a classic example of this. When the fraud was discovered, the share price plummeted. So it's a totally different ballpark to a breach in regulation. There's no real moral stigma attached to breaching regulation, while being branded even a possible criminal, let alone an international one, is something everyone wants to avoid. It moves into the territory of the taboo. And this is exactly what's needed. So criminal law is what we use to indicate taboo in the legal system. Taboos are protective, and that's what criminal law is fundamentally about. It's about safety. Murder is not a crime in order to punish murderers. That's just how it works. What it's for is to stop people killing each other. And a crime of ecocide aims to function the same way. This is also why our approach with supporting the establishment of this law has been to involve as many different sectors of society as possible in the conversation, as I was saying earlier. The real window of strategic change is actually in that period of time between when people hear about the law and when it actually comes into play, because that becomes a default compliance period. It's the space in which the useful questions can be asked. And why do I say useful questions? Well, actually, this is where we come to the importance of the definition of ecocide. The definition that has been proposed at the International Criminal Court is the one that emerged from an independent expert panel of top lawyers from around the world, convened by our foundation in 2020. In June of 2021, they reached consensus on the following definition. And there are further definitions of terms, and I think somebody might pop the link into the chat for us if you want to look at it in more detail. But this is the core of it. It's beautifully concise, and as anyone that's heard me speak before will know, I usually just show you the fact that it fits on the back of a business card. This is so useful when you're dealing with busy politicians. So ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Now, there are a number of reasons why this is a rather brilliant definition, and within a year of its launch, it had become the de facto starting point for legal, political, and academic discussions all around the world. Almost all of the proposed definitions in various parliaments, including the definition that partially ended up in the EU directive, are based on or inspired by this definition. However, there is one particular reason that has become clear to us over time as being perhaps the most powerful, and it's this. This definition is based not on a list of acts, but on the severity of consequence. Not all, but most environmental laws are in the regulatory sphere, and they include long prescriptive lists of do's and don'ts. And this is important for the minutiae of what's permissible, but what often happens in practice is that particularly in the context of wealthy transnational companies, it can be gamed. If such and such an activity is prohibited, well, then let's reclassify what we do as something slightly different that isn't. And if X amount of a toxin is permitted, let's always be right at the red line on it. If Y activity triggers a fine or even a court case, let's do a cost-benefit analysis and see if the profit makes it worth the risk. By contrast, this definition of ecocide is based on the results of what you do. Murder or manslaughter is not defined by the way you kill, but it's not defined by the way. It's not defined by the way you kill someone. but by the fact that they end up dead. In the context of severe environmental damage, this approach is fundamentally important because it triggers a completely different mindset. It creates a sort of practical reality check where risk managers, operational directors, and C-suite executives have to start asking themselves what they're actually doing. What are we actually doing on the ground or in our supply chains? And does it or will it cause severe harm? And if it will, what should we do about it? What alternatives are there? How can we do this differently, do it better? And the list goes on. I love this because it starts connecting dots. There is a wealth of both scientific and on-the-ground lived experience knowledge about what activities cause which harms. Similarly, there is already a wealth of knowledge of healthier approaches in many sectors that will be far better consulted when those questions are being asked. And I love this about human beings generally, because we just have the most incredibly creative minds, if only we ask the right questions. Our species is renowned for its lack of specialization and its consequent ability to ask and answer questions inside our minds. We're versatile problem solvers par excellence. And right now, we, and especially the we that are in key positions in large companies and governments, are simply not in the habit of asking the right questions. And ecocide defined in this way provokes those questions. And in doing so, it calls us, and crucially, it calls those of us in positions of high-level decision-making power into alignment with responsibility. It helps us to internalize that responsibility, which speaks to a very profound requirement on the planet right now. And there is another aspect I want to highlight about ecocide law, and that's the word ecocide itself is very powerful. And this is for a number of reasons, partly because it sounds like genocide and has a distinct weight and seriousness, the sense of a sort of equivalence to mass murder. And that factor alone is powerful. When you put ecocide alongside genocide, what you're saying is that mass harm to the environment is as bad, wrong, and dangerous as mass harm to people. And that has a shifting effect in our minds about our responsibility towards the natural world. It's also a lot easier to grasp as a word and concept than other initiatives, which are maybe aiming at similar directions, but have longer and more complicated names. The UN, for example, currently has a draft legally binding treaty on transnational corporations, human rights violations, and environmental damage. And I can't even actually remember the full title exactly, but the shortening of it to legally binding treaty does absolutely nothing for the understanding of anyone outside a very strict, restricted circle of insiders. But with ecocide, it's much easier to get a handle on. You stop someone in the street and talk about ecocide, it's like there's something that lands quite quickly about the word. But it's also about the etymological roots of the word. So it comes from the Greek oikos, meaning home, and the Latin cadere, meaning to kill. So it literally, etymologically means to kill one's home. And quite apart from the fact that this is a rather apt way to describe the way we've been treating our planetary home, it also speaks to another profound part of being human, and that is our deep, deep need for belonging. Belonging is what our mindset of disconnection has deprived us of. It's the gap that advertisers would have us believe they can fill with their products or services. And actually, social media is perhaps the quintessential example of this. It can sometimes genuinely, though often temporarily, provide community. At the same time, it tracks what brings groups together, uses that data to enhance the activity which creates the backlash against those same groupings, purely because the algorithms exacerbate every polarization possible just by their nature. Because on a platform where the only currency is attention, that is what the algorithms will do. And we're not even the customer in that context. Our attention, our behavior are the product. And our lack of and our deep need for belonging makes us very susceptible to sort of pack type behavior. And headlines become content, nuance gets lost, rationality is lost, empathy is lost, safety in communication is lost, and it's hard to know, where is home? Where do we truly belong? We can't know what someone else is reading because they're getting fed a whole bunch of different information to us. Is it any wonder that we see out in the world that that need for belonging and the manipulation of that need playing out in recent years across the geopolitical stage in confusing and quite frightening ways? I was at a conference last week where one of the speakers asked us all to visualize home, what home meant to us, how home made us feel. And he then showed us a picture of the Earth from space and asked how many people in the audience had had that picture in their minds and it was only very few. And I felt almost guilty that my image of home had not been that one, but my own home and garden. And it seemed that around probably 98% of the room had had a similar experience. I sort of felt we'd been tricked, like I'd been exposed to myself as someone who didn't somehow care enough about the whole planet, which in the light of what I do is kind of crazy and clearly not the case. Also last week, I read an intriguing piece of writing about how governance might look in the future. So high-level governance, how networked, multi-layered and non-geographical, non-sovereign state-based forms of governance will be required because of the sheer interconnectedness and complexity of civilization. The problem then becomes, how can we avoid an ever more sophisticated tech elite ending up with increased power and either no transparency or a transparency that benefits nobody because the workings of governments themselves have become so complex? And both of these contexts made me realize something. They made me realize how profoundly we are all actually creatures of place and are perhaps at our best when our lives and our ways of governing acknowledge this. Home and belonging are deeply and specifically place-based for the vast majority of people. Home is what most people will defend above everything else. Yes, Earth is our collective and currently our only planetary home. And also, people care about the living world mostly because we relate strongly to somewhere highly specific within it. A forest, a river, a valley, a mountain, a garden, the ocean in a particular place. I mean, the list goes on. And it may be where we grew up, but it doesn't have to be. It might be somewhere we discover. We don't always find our roots where we spent our childhoods. We protect what we care about, and we care about what we connect to, and where we feel at home, where we feel we belong, we feel connected. And that matters more than anything for our life to feel not only more worthwhile, but also safer. And I feel that ecocide law speaks to this in a very direct way. Killing one's home can and does happen in many ways, although not all of them are physical. So precisely for this reason, there is something deeply rooting and grounding about putting in place a law that returns us to a place of responsibility for home by protecting all the geographical, specific, vital ecosystems without which there isn't any collective home. Now, there's a lot of, recent years have seen a lot of discourse and response at policy level and conversations worldwide about emergency, climate emergency, ecological emergency. I would say that ecocide law, while deeply relevant to this, deeply relevant to climate, is not an emergency response to climate change. It isn't suddenly required because of ecological crisis. On the contrary, it's the other way around. Ecological crisis has arisen precisely because of its absence. Ecocide law has always been required. It is truly the ground rule in every sense for humanity to thrive in harmony with our collective home, the Earth. And I believe that, the reason it is now being proposed, it's beginning to be put in place around the world, is because now, somewhat belatedly, we have reached the moment where this is understood broadly enough to do so. It's not about what we know is happening. The information's been around a long time. Ecocide law is about our response to what we understand it to mean. Anyway, I shall leave it there for now, but I'm much looking forward to the rest of the session and just having a chance to expand the conversation in any direction you'd like to take it.
So thank you very much for a very quick summary of ecocide law and how it all came about. And yeah, I remember the start of it all when 2017 when I came first across it, and it was still Polly Higgins mainly in those days. So yeah, I'm just so happy to have you here. And there are a few questions in here for Naomi asked, for example, could ecocide law make international standards mechanisms, for example, RSPO or FSC, effective, and other regulatory frameworks, for example, EUDR?
That's actually a really good question, because the way, I don't know if you saw the link to the definition in the chat. But part of the definition of ecocide that's been proposed is that ecocide refers to unlawful or wanton acts that create a certain level of harm or risk of harm. And the unlawful part is hugely relevant here, because part of the problem is that, we have these directives and we have these sort of legal standards or whatever, but they're not always adhered to. In fact, they're often not adhered to or not monitored and not followed. I mean, just to give an example, even the environmental crimes that currently exist, like wildlife trafficking, illegal logging, and so on, the ones that extend beyond borders, are already as lucrative as drug trafficking. So they're in the top 3 or 4 most criminally lucrative practices on the planet, and yet in comparison, they're hardly investigated, reported, prosecuted. So putting something in place that will effectively add a layer to that whole very diverse legal structures, but they're there, is that if what you're doing is in breach of local or international laws, and by doing it you are threatening a certain degree of harm, then yes, ecocide law would kick in. So in a sense, it's about creating a foundational layer that is not currently there, but that will create a kind of fundamental support for existing regulation, which is currently not being taken seriously enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's another question by Alex Rawling. He says, excellent presentation. Can ecocide law eventually help protect landscapes because of the damage and destruction in pursuit of resources that could be found on or in them?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. This is the aim of ecocide law. I mean, what I will be specific about here is that it's aimed at an international level crime. So the effects have to be pretty serious. It's not going to cover every kind of environmental damage. And it's actually quite important that it is that narrow, because there's something about underlining the seriousness of the worst crimes that gives a kind of credence and weight to the range of other regulations that are in place. There can be a slight tendency sometimes, because the situation feels so desperate to many people, there can be quite a tendency to want to hang quite a lot on ecocide law, and that the important thing here is being able to insert something into a system that already exists. By adding an additional international crime. But there's also something, again, I'll come back to this definition, which is a remarkable definition. One of this aspect of unlawful or wanton as a second threshold is very important in the water. One of the other things it does is it draws forward the development of better regulation in particular areas, literally geographical areas, but also obviously different sectors. Because as the regulation or the protective requirements become better in a given area, that will also play into this definition. So a new regulation to protect a certain landscape would then obviously come under this definition if it was breached and caused a lot of harm. So it's both a way of sort of politically respecting the fact that there are different bodies of law in different jurisdictions. So doesn't just cut across everything and say, if you create this level of harm, it's ecocide, end of story. But it says, if you're in breach of existing regulations, or what you're doing has a disproportionately severe effect, then it becomes ecocide. But it, as I say, it has this effect of sort of drawing forward and acknowledging, in a way, the work of all of the experts, activists, academics, scientists that are working on the improvement of other areas of environmental regulation.
Yeah, I would think it might be just like the difference between human rights laws and genocide sort of thing. Is it the same level of?
There is definitely a complementarity there. So, I mean, for example, many on this call will be familiar with the rights of nature movement. Which has grown a lot in the last few decades, and that there are now many examples around the world. And I know there are some people in this audience who've worked on some of these very specifically, in at least 30 jurisdictions that have, where there have been wins for specific landscape features, for example, whether it's rivers or mountains or forests. And the relationship that we perceive between that movement and ecocide law is that they're complementary. They're sort of almost two sides of a coin. I mean, to use the very most basic example, your basic human right is the right to life, but it's not
Yeah.
worth very much if murder isn't a crime. You know,
Yeah.
the fact that murder is a crime protects your right to life. And ecocide will behave in a similar way with regard to the rights of nature. And of course, some human rights. I mean, the newly acknowledged right to a clean and healthy environment, for example.
Yeah, that's just brought me to the for example, in the UK, all the pollution of the rivers and the sewage problem. How would that fit in with these laws of with the
I actually think
ecocide?
it's probably the best example in the UK of what could hit the
Yeah.
level of ecocide, in the sense that, you know, the definition of widespread is, you know, it comes in various ways. It's sort of, it could be, you know, it's something that affects an entire ecosystem or an entire species, or, you know, transboundary or cross-border situations, you know, or a great number of people. I mean, there are various ways of defining it within this definition. And I think, you know, an entire river system could plausibly come within that definition. And you can imagine what kind of effect that would have on the head honchos of water companies and so on, in regard to their decision making, or, you know, or what they're prepared to overlook or not bother with, which is often the case. So yeah, I think that's a very good example.
Yeah. Nick is asking, how significant a setback for Stop Ecocide is the UK, in brackets, Labour government decision on Friday to squash the climate and environment bill?
That is hugely disappointing, isn't it? Really is.
Yeah.
But I mean, in terms of a setback for us, for Stop Ecocide International, or rather for the overall ecocide law movement, I wouldn't call it a massive one, because we operate on a global scale. You know, I mean, interestingly, before they were elected, Labour actually publicly supported ecocide law, at least at the international level, on a number of occasions. They've not been challenged on that recently. Also, because one of the things that we've learned in the course of what we do is that a collaborative approach, an inclusive approach, a non-political, non-partisan approach are all very important when you're dealing at the political level, because at the diplomatic level, sorry, because there are always different kinds of pressures that are involved at the level of foreign policy. So we would not consider it the right moment yet to approach the UK government about ecocide law at the international level, but we believe that time will come. And it will certainly help that previously this government, when it was in opposition, has significantly backed the ecocide law, the ecocide crime initiative. So we'll see. So yeah, I mean, disappointing, but in no way a major setback, we would say.
Yeah, but maybe it just makes the streets wider for ecocide law if the other bills aren't in place. So in a sort of strange way.
It can go either way. I mean, it's sometimes surprising what the the effects of things can be, and we've definitely learned to stay nimble in that respect.
Yeah.
And to, you know, to sort of to work towards. I mean, you probably, I mean, some of you may know that actually Scotland is moving quite concretely towards an ecocide law. I mean, there's a proposal that's been backed by a good number of Scottish MPs, and is now sort of moving forward through the procedures of Scottish laws. So, yeah, that might be a little poke for Westminster, shall we say? But I mean, it's interesting that at the international level, it's the African and Latin American countries that are really coming on board with this conversation at the moment. I mean, obviously the Pacific ones are the ones that have been driving it at the front end, but we've definitely had a lot more interest from those regions in the last year or so. And it's interesting because, you know, understandably, some people have accused the International Criminal Court of being a neo-colonial institution. It's only run a fairly small number of prosecutions. They've been against Africans and so on. I'm not saying any of that is wrong, but there's something about ecocide law that behaves a little differently to the other international crimes. So the International Criminal Court is meant to be a court of last resort, a complementary court. So it's not meant to be the first port of call. But of course, if you're a war criminal or a genocidal maniac, your own country is not going to be prosecuting you for fairly obvious reasons. And therefore, in a sense, you're much more likely by default to have to be prosecuted at the ICC, for example. But with ecocide, which is not exclusively, but largely a corporate, the result of reckless corporate activity, there's not the same state level investment. And ideally, what would happen going forward is that actually those prosecutions will be taken in national jurisdictions in countries that have ratified the international crime. And that's exactly how it should work. Everything shouldn't end up at the International Criminal Court. It would collapse instantly. That's not how it's meant to work. But with ecocide, it actually has the potential to restore it to the relationship it's supposed to have with the, the sovereign states that ratify crimes there. So, yeah.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, else everything would just end up there. Jonathan is asking, would the law apply retroactively or only apply to future environmental crimes after the law is accepted?
It's the latter, I'm afraid, which is sometimes disappointing for people. But at the same time, I mean, one of the things I was saying in my talk was actually, it sort of touches on this. It's actually very important, weirdly, that it doesn't come into play retroactively, that it just comes into play when the law comes in, because as I said, it's not about how many people you throw in jail. It's about whether we start actually changing behavior and protecting the planet. And to do that, we need to have a run-up, as in corporations need to know it's coming so that they can actually examine their practices, so that they can actually think about it. And in fact, reports have started to come out in the last couple of years from investment groups and finance and business groups saying this is something boards of directors need to start paying attention to, because it's, clearly on its way. I mean, it's funny. I mean, for us, we started off very much in the kind of space of demanding ecocide law, if you like. So stop ecocide. This is something you need to do, something you need to talk about. We're now in a position, if the train has actually left the station, this is happening. Some countries have done it already. The EU, 25 of the 27 EU countries will have to harmonise with that directive in the next couple of years. It won't go the whole way towards eco, but it's a strong foundation. There's now a diplomatic conversation at the ICC. So, like I say, the train has left the station. This is about now informing people. This is coming, or something like it is coming fairly soon. We don't know exactly when, to your particular corner of the world, but it's time you paid attention to it. And that is that's a very concrete shift.
Yeah. That makes a whole lot of difference to know it's coming, and not somewhere in the future there might be something, It makes a whole lot of difference. It's more concrete now.
Definitely. And of course now, the insurance industry is starting to get interested. The investment industry is already, pension funds and all those kinds of people are paying attention quite seriously now.
Yeah, Nick asks, you rightly bracket ecocide with genocide. Recently, however, in the context of Gaza genocide, we have seen the serious erosion of respect for the ICC, which you mentioned, the ICJ, and rules-based order generally. Does this erosion also threaten the future development and efficacy of an ecocide law?
This is a brilliant question, because we are right in a period right now where international law itself is in a more precarious place than it's been for some time, and that's a completely reasonable question. Interestingly, when we started this work, and Polly's advocacy, prior to the beginning of Stop Ecocide International, was all about the International Criminal Court, for a number of reasons, and one of those reasons was that it's where we perceive the worst crimes to be prosecuted. So there's this kind of hierarchy there of criminal law. But also, one of the reasons that we continued with that is a kind of looking for coherence, in the sense that if we'd have begun by sort of country by country, we could have ended up with many different definitions, many different stages of progress, everything taking decades and so on. And so part of the idea of going to that point first was this sense that, when a country ratifies something there, it's going to adopt something very similar into its own penal code, because obviously that's part of the complementary relationship. And therefore you create a certain kind of coherence where everybody is understanding the same thing as being bad, wrong, and dangerous. Now, actually, in practice, what's happened is we've ended up with both things happening at once. We didn't predict this, but it's actually, we think, very positive. And it's been the result of the definition. So the definition that emerged in 2021 was the first time there'd been a kind of internationally drafted consensus definition that came from, top lawyers from around the world, but also lawyers from different backgrounds, humanitarian, criminal, climate, and so on, environmental law. And that definition has inspired a lot of the progress in many specific parts of the world as well as regionally. So what we're actually now seeing, and I know it doesn't sound like I'm answering your question, but I will be in a second, is that what has happened is that in national jurisdictions across a number of regions, there's a lot of interest, and also we've already seen regional level developments. So while it is possible, I mean, we hope it won't, that isn't the way it's going to go. But, should the worst case scenario happen, and actually there's a kind of a collapse of the international legal structures in that way, that in fact, national structures and regional structures have already taken up this direction of travel. And ultimately, it doesn't particularly matter how it happens, so long as there is a kind of majority and global acceptance of this ground rule. However, I'm going to add to this, because we actually believe that ecocide law has at least some potential to shore up the international rules-based order and the ICC, because it is non-political, non-ideological, universal. It's, this is something that is affecting everybody on the planet in different ways in different places, but it's something that's completely relatable regardless of your ideology or your politics. Unlike various conflict situations, for example. And not only that, but it is often deeply intertwined with the origins of conflicts, and indeed, and what happens during a conflict.
Oops.
To bring a conversation into the international law scenario, debate, context, if you like, that could actually be positive. So, I mean, obviously, none of this is guaranteed, but actually we've been positively surprised at the kinds of effects that this conversation has actually built up over the last few years.
May I just shortly, was this just me losing Jojo for a moment, or was that everybody else too? No? Yeah.
Quite a few.
Okay.
Oh dear, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I thought it was just me because we had that storm passing through earlier. So yeah.
It's very stormy where I am, so maybe that's why.
Yeah. Can happen. Yeah.
Nick, did that sort of adequately answer your question? I don't know if you caught it all.
He said yes, it's okay.
Brilliant. I can see
I
him putting
did
a
catch
thumb
it
up.
all, and it did answer it. Thank you very much, Jojo, and congratulations for all the work you're doing.
So yeah, another
Thank you.
question. Oh, Nicola is asking, can you speak about earth protectors and how well it has been received in court?
Okay, this speaks back to the beginnings of
Yeah.
the work, where we started basing this campaign on a legal document that would help, that was actually sort of legally stamped, if you like, in most countries in the world, to enable it to be used in court for example, environmental protesters. Now, actually, in practice, it's quite interesting. What we discovered is that actually what mattered in the end was not the document. What mattered was the narrative. And the narrative was indeed successfully used in a number of court cases, particularly in the UK. It's not something that is a primary focus of what we do now. Obviously, the ultimate aim was always about the legislation for ecocide. And of course, that has ramped up so much that we literally, even if we wanted to try and focus on that aspect of it, we probably wouldn't have 2 seconds to rub together to do it. On the other hand, we certainly would acknowledge that the narrative around a kind of conscientious protection, it was called, I mean, Polly sort of coined this term conscientious protectors, that kind of fits into that kind of narrative of conscientious objection historically. And it's like a conscientious protector. It's almost like going one step further than a conscientious objector. They're actually acting to prevent harm. but yeah, that narrative was very powerful. But I actually can't think of an instance where the document in practice actually mattered that much. But it was interesting to see how that worked as a narrative. I mean, the other thing, of course, is that, you know, the whole environmental defenders situation has been quite dire around the world for some time. Global Witness did a report on it not that long ago. And, you know, there's a lot of threat to those who do stand at the front lines. And actually, of course, you know, ecocide law itself will be a hugely useful tool for those environmental defenders, because it will actually be, you know, a sort of recourse that can, you know, that can be used at the, well, potentially local, but also international level. And it shifts and again, I mean, this is again a narrative point really, but it shifts the narrative hugely. So, you know, those who are currently portrayed as criminals interrupting legitimate business activity, that suddenly changes to, I mean, if the question mark is then over the activity as to whether it's legitimate, then that completely changes the framing of those protesters, those defenders. You know, they become the moral upholders of the law, and that's a very different place to be in terms of how you, you know, how you're viewed, kind of thing. So that is actually quite an important point. Yeah.
Yeah, I have quite a few questions with regards to that narrative, because there's Barbara Ann who asks about, like with genocide deniers, there will be or are ecocide deniers too. How do you counter their narrative, especially those deniers who hold positions of authority and power and can block this? And also Antoinette Carr, how would such a law get past the resistance of the people with vested interests in the damage? I would think those two go into the same direction, of those people who
Sure.
actually profit from this denial.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very legitimate question, but I mean, I hope that I can be somewhat reassuring in the sense that ecocide law is really hard to object to publicly. I mean, if you think about it, even those companies, you know, the big extractive companies, you know, have spent decades kind of greenwashing and trying to persuade us that actually what they're doing is fine, or, you know, and you can't greenwash with criminal law. You just can't. I mean, they can't, you know, if they now come out and say, we don't think this is a good idea, they've trashed all of those millions they've invested in greenwashing. So they're not going to do it. And if they, you know, I mean, I guess if they decide they're actually going to come on board, then effectively what they're saying is we agree to be banned by this law. So actually, it's one of the reasons why the discourse in the public space around this is so important, because publicly, and we've already been at the point for a couple of years now where no government wants to be seen objecting to this, because they will just look terrible. So they won't do it. What they'll do is they'll sidestep, they'll hesitate, they'll look at other, you know, other potential solutions, but they won't say this is a bad idea. Who's going to say it's a bad idea to stop trashing the planet? You know, you're just going to look awful. So there is one level at which, you know, it's the easiest campaign in the world, because it's really hard to argue against. So what I don't doubt is happening is that there will be behind closed doors conversations where people, you know, don't necessarily want to back this. I mean, I assume that some of those conversations may be relevant to the fact that the climate and nature bill wasn't supported. I mean, you know, it could be, you know, all sorts of pressures that come into play once somebody's in government. I don't know if pennies actually still have this, but the UK penny used to have a portcullis on it. I don't know if you remember that. I mean, I think it did until quite recently. But I kind of feel like once you get into government, it's like I can almost visualize all of these portcullises kind of coming down around you, where, you know, suddenly you've got all of these vested interests to deal with. You've got foreign policy and geopolitics to deal with. You've got all sorts of things that actually are hugely and often very real pressures that have to be dealt with. You know, that obviously from the outside we can go, well, that's just completely lacking in integrity. And then if you are actually in that place, it's probably, I mean, I would hate it. I don't know how people do it. But, you know, at the same time, I think as I say, I think this is, you know, the train's left the station. I actually don't think it's going to be possible to stop this now, because it is so, you know, common sense and obvious on one level. And also, as I say, because a lot of the developing countries are really interested in this. And when it comes down to it, they're the ones with the resources.
Its time has come. Yeah. Yeah. That's sometimes how it happens. The time has come. Yeah.
That's what we're feeling.
Well, thank you so much. Jonathan is back to remind us that the time is proceeding.
And to just express a massive thanks to you, Jojo. That was incredibly comprehensive for everybody kind of who, whether people are unfamiliar with kind of the background of this movement, you've brought us all up to date. And for those who have been kind of aware of, it's been fantastic to hear kind of the latest developments and how it's moving forward. I believe that we've been sharing kind of plenty of the links in the chat there so that people can find out how they can follow more. But if you have a chance kind of after the talk, do have a look, because there's a lot of love and gratitude being expressed to you for your dedication and your work and your passion and energy that we can see so clearly here, and that you've been given to this movement overall. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's been an honor. Thank you so much.